Hi folks, we're going to take a look at a question about finding the x-intercepts of a quadratic function, and the method we're going to use is factoring. So let's take a look here. We want to find the x-intercepts of this quadratic function, and one way in which to find the x-intercepts is to factor the expression on the right. Now, of course, we know that factoring doesn't always work, so we will be looking at another way of doing this, but when we can factor, that is one of the options. Okay, so the first thing to remember is that if we're looking for the x-intercepts of a function, it means that the y value, which is represented by f at x, has to be equal to 0. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is replace your y value, now you know, has to be equal to 0. And we started with what we call a quadratic function, so this represents a whole parabola, but by replacing the y value by 0, we now have what's called a quadratic equation, something that we can solve. Okay, so one way to solve these quadratic equations is to factor. So first thing we look for here is a common factor, and I see 6, 13, and 5, and I realize pretty quickly that there's no common factor. Okay, so my next step is to factor this trinomial into two binomials. Now, since the coefficient of x is not equal to 1, in this case here it's equal to 6, I know I'm going to have to use decomposition. So let's just go through that. So the first thing I have to do is find two numbers that multiply to a times c. So the two numbers have to multiply to negative 30, 6 times negative 5, and they have to add up to negative 13. And so here you go through your possibilities. So 1 and 30 definitely won't work. So let's go. Well, we can also get 2 and 15. And we realize, that might work. So we know that we need to get negative 13. So it makes sense that the larger number has to be negative and the smaller number has to be positive. And so let's check that out. 2 minus 15 is indeed equal to negative 13. Okay, so we have our two numbers, and this is what we use to do our decomposition. So 6x squared, and we're going to split up minus 13x using these two numbers. I'm going to write this as plus 2x minus 15x, and then minus 5. Okay, and here 2x minus 15x is indeed equal to negative 13. So we do this so that we can group together the first two terms and the last two terms, and now do some common factoring between these. So here we look at 6x squared and 2x. The common factor would be 2x. Okay, let's factor that out. So what am I left with? Well, I'm left with 1x, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. So I'm left with 3x, and here 2x, I've taken out both the x and the 2, so I'm just left with plus 1. Okay. Now let's do the same thing with the last two terms. Let's factor that out. Now remember that what I want in this bracket should be exactly the same as what I have in the first one. So since I need a positive 3x, I'm going to make sure that I factor out a negative number here. So it's going to be negative, and what's the common factor between 15 and 5? Well, that's just 5, so I'm going to factor out a negative 5. And here we're left with, well, negative 15 divided by negative 5 is positive 3x. And then here negative 5 divided by negative 5 is just equal to plus 1. So again, we need to get the same binomial on each side of the expression, because now this becomes our common factor. So I'm going to factor out 3x plus 1. And let's see what we're left with here. We're left with a 2x on the left and a minus 5 on the right. And so by decomposition, we've managed to factor this expression. Why that's important is because now I have two expressions that multiply to 0. And the principle we use here is that if two expressions multiply to 0, either the first has to be equal to 0, so that's one possibility, or the other possibility is that the second one has to be equal to 0. So 2x minus 5 must be equal to 0. Okay? And now we can, in each of these, solve to find the actual x-intercept. So let's solve this one here. 3x, we bring the plus 1 to the other side, it becomes minus 1. And then we divide both sides by 3, so x is equal to negative 1/3. Or here, we've got 2x, let's bring the 5 to the other side, so the minus 5 is going to become a positive. And now I divide both sides by 2, so I get 5/2. And so my x-intercepts are negative 1/3 and 5/2. Okay, so just a recap. When you're solving an equation or solving a problem where you have to find the x-intercepts, okay, one method for doing that is to find the factored form of the equation. Okay, so first set y equal to 0, factor the right-hand side, and then you can make the deduction that because you have two expressions that multiply to 0, either the first one is 0 or the second one is 0. Okay, and that's it.